Thank you very much for that introduction and also for the very kind gifts. Very much appreciated. And that's, well, even halfway, just only halfway through my contributions because I did one seminar and this is my second seminar. So let's hope I live up to expectations tonight. Thank you very much for coming, for being here to join me for the next hour and a half, 2 hours. Let's see how we go on this session, in the session on mixed methods research. So, I was here about 2 weeks ago talking about participatory methods, as Joseph said, but most of the faces in this room are new. So for that purpose, I will just introduce myself a little bit more and the center I work for to give you some background as to why I am here and why it might be useful to talk to you about mixed methods, because I come from a different speciality and disciplinary background. So I just want to convey to you how it might still be relevant to your area of study and work. So I work at the Institute of Development Studies, and that's development in the sense of development for countries. So how to develop developing countries to move out of poverty, have more economic growth, and have less inequality. So just as a reflection on our strategy from our institute, these are our 3 main headings. We want to reduce inequality, so between poor and rich, between urban and rural areas, etc. We want to make sure that it happens in a sustainable way, so that also looks at climate change issues. And we want to make sure that there is secure and inclusive society, so without conflict and crisis. Now, why is this relevant? It's because what we do to make this happen is very evidence-based. So we are here on a seminar session, series for the Center for Evidence-Based Practice. And the research that we do is very much focused on trying to convince policymakers or whoever implement programs in these developing countries to try and tackle these different issues to reduce poverty, etc. So the work that we do, the research, the policy advice, the consultancies are all framed around what we call engaged excellence. So we like to do top of the bill research as academics, but we want to make sure that it's used and that people for whom it's useful actually use it. So we do very much like to publish in high-ranked journals, but at the same time we want to make sure it's also published in reports and policy briefs that are accessible, both because they're not behind a paywall, but also because of the language that we use to those who are actually making use of the materials, right? So that brings me to today's topic, which is using mixed methods, so a whole load of different types of research methods in trying to evaluate programs or creating evidence that's helpful for programming and policy making. And what I will tell you today is focused on the research perspective, but also very much keeping in mind that whatever we do has to be translated in policy and programs in real life. And so there's a link that we have to make between the academic stuff, the technical stuff, and the practical stuff. Right, so that's the background out of the way. Today, we're going to talk about the use of mixed methods in program evaluation, or more broadly, in understanding different dynamics and processes. What we're going to discuss briefly is what are mixed methods? What are some of the definitions? What are some of the understandings? How can we use mixed methods, the different ways of doing this? And then finally, I'm going to spend some time talking through an example of our own research on child poverty that really used the mixed methods approach, just as an illustration of how things can come together, what the challenges are, and how it can be useful. Before I do this, I would like to know a little bit more about you who are in the room. So maybe some of you have been to seminars by my other half earlier in the week or the weeks before, and you've been asked to come up front. I'm going to do the same thing. I want to ask you to come up front. I'm not going to ask anybody any scary questions or put you on the spot. So feel free to just come here. You can go back to your seat after we've done a few introductory questions. Please move off your seats and come to the front. Don't worry, you're safe. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot. I just want to know who's in the room. Okay, almost here, yeah. Very good. So I know from the list, those of you who signed up, that we have people from different disciplines or study areas in the room. But what I want to know from you is whether you, as a researcher, identify as somebody who does mostly quantitative research or qualitative research, or as a student, whether you find that the area of study that you're in is mostly focused on quantitative data, so numbers, or mostly focused on more qualitative data, more narratives, more discourse, stories, etc. If you think you are in the quantitative group, can you go to this side of the room? If you think you are in the qualitative group, can you go to this side of the room? And if you feel you're somewhere in between, which is also fine, you can go right in the middle. All right, so does that mean we really only have quantitative? Okay, can I ask you what you are studying or working on? History, okay. I would say that's mostly qualitative, yeah? Okay, so I'm intrigued because from the list I saw there was a few people that had also history or Chinese behind their names. Does anybody want to elaborate? And I know psychology, I can get that. I can see why psychology would be on the quantitative side. So anybody in the quantitative group who would like to say anything about why they think it's more quantitative? Can I ask you, just to be sure, are you exactly clear what I mean with the difference between quantitative and qualitative? Yeah? Okay, brilliant. So then, just one word, what is your area of study? Is it history, Chinese, psychology, counseling, anything else? Psychology, yeah. Ladies in the middle. Chinese? But you feel more comfortable with the quantitative side of things than the qualitative side of things? Or maybe in between? I have to be honest, I wouldn't really find it easy to categorize languages in either of these research methods either. So I would understand that you might be wavering a little bit. Okay, but you've placed yourself on this end of the scale and you're a solitary person on the firmly on the qualitative side. But that's great. We can work with that. So the next question I want to ask you then, do you have a sense of what mixed methods is? If you say yes, can you go to that side of the room? If you say no, please go to this side of the room. If you say yes, I will not ask you to explain it. So don't worry, if you say yes, don't feel like you're going to be handed the microphone. But if you have any sense of what today is going to be about, the mixed methods, please go to the yes side.
I'm not 100% sure, but I just maybe I
That's okay. Yeah. Just a sense, yeah. Yeah. Just a sense of what it might be. Okay. So you have some sense of what it might be, some idea? Yeah? It's completely new to you. Yeah? So do you have any expectations of what we might discuss today, or it's just something new and open that you're interested in? Something new? Okay, brilliant. My next question was whether you would like to use them, but maybe that's a bit premature. Maybe I'll just keep that question until the very end, and we do this again after we've spoken a little bit about what mixed methods are, what the advantages are, and the challenges. You reflect for yourself as we're going through the lecture. Is this something I might use? Is this something I might want to explore further? Or if you say, no, I'll stick to what I know and what I use, that's fine as well. Think about it a little bit as we go through, and then at the very end, I'll ask you to come back again and ask those questions, okay? Thank you for coming. You can go back to your seats now, and I'll do the talking. Okay, so the first part of this lecture is about what are mixed methods. So some definitions, some basic understanding of what we're actually talking about. So I dug up one definition that's around. And before I do that, I should say that my background is in economics, development economics, and more broadly in social sciences, right? So what I will present today is from a particular strand of literature on mixed methods that is very grounded in social sciences, in economics, also a little bit of sociology, and very applied to the study of development and the study of poverty. That doesn't mean that you can't adopt it for history, psychology, or other study areas, but just for you to keep in the back of your mind that this is my particular lens through which I consider mixed methods. With that in mind, I think this definition is probably pretty universal. So it says mixed methods research means that you adopt a research strategy that has more than just one type of research methods. And the methods can be a mix of qualitative and quantitative, or a mix of quantitative and different qualitative types of methods. And so if you think about it, in effect, it is everything apart from just doing one particular type of research, using one type of data collection and analysis. It's everything but just using a survey questionnaire and running a regression model. It's everything but just doing focus groups and analyzing that through text analysis or coding. Anything that you do in trying to bring those together, or trying to bring different quantitative or different qualitative methods together, refers to mixed methods. And so, you know, it's like this box with different colored balls. If any method is any ball, then any mix works. There is no fixed rules. Having said that, I'm going to show you what the most common form and the most frequently used way of mixing methods is, that we've seen a lot in the last 15 to 10 years, particularly in my area of research. And that's the combination of quantitative data collection and analysis parallel to qualitative data collection and analysis. And then once these two processes are completed, you look at the data in parallel and you combine the findings. So it's two quite separate processes that you combine at the very end. Can anybody mention an example of a quantitative method? I just gave it away, but just testing whether you're awake. Yeah, survey questionnaire, right? I think it's probably something that most of you are familiar with. You go out to lots of people, ask a fixed set of questions. In fact, you have one in front of you for the evaluation. That's a survey questionnaire. And the bigger your sample, the more types of analysis, regression modeling you can do with it. So that's one strand. What about the qualitative methods? Interviews, yes, but more open-ended interviews, right? So you might have an interview guide, but you allow for more open-ended answers. You might allow for follow-up questions or probing questions. Because you could argue when you have a questionnaire and instead of you filling it out by yourself as you're doing now, I could also do it in an interview. Most of the surveys that I work with are actually done in an interview rather than people having people fill out the questionnaires themselves. So it would be interviews that are a bit more open-ended, or group discussions, for example. Or 2 weeks ago, we had the participatory methods workshop, which is a lot more with different exercises, a lot more open-ended. That's also within the qualitative category of things. And you would do those parallel and then you combine it. That's what you most frequently do. Now, thinking about these two different strands, I don't know whether you refer to this in the same way in psychology or in other areas, but in our field, in social sciences, we refer to a certain type of quantitative methods, the randomized control trial, and other experimental design as the gold standard for program evaluation. And then you might also refer to some qualitative methods that are rigorous in their own way, so a certain type of interviews with a certain sample or case studies that allow you to unpick causal mechanisms. You can also refer to those as gold standards. Now, these two people have actually said, well, what if we combine those two and then we could make a platinum standard, which is just a step up from the gold standard. We take the best of these two worlds, we put them together, mix them, and we can add rigor, we can add depth, we can add texture to our data and to our findings that actually makes it even better than these methods are in their own right. So as you can see in this language, there's quite a lot of enthusiasm around mixed methods. There's a recognition that these individual methods can do a lot, but they have their shortcomings, either methodologically or just by the mere fact that they are a single method. They give a certain perspective, provide a certain angle, but that's all they do. If you combine them, you can really strengthen your analysis. And so here is a list of some of the benefits of mixed methods that you see in a lot of different papers that argue for mixed methods. So one is the combination of breadth and depth. So what we mean with breadth is an indication of scale. So what you get with the questionnaires is usually you have a large sample size, so you have an answer to questions for a lot of different people. It's a very broad sweep of what you're investigating. But you can only ask so many questions in a questionnaire. And also you have to predetermine what you ask right at the very beginning before you go out and ask them. So you can argue it's not a very deep way of collecting data. The depth comes from those interviews where you sit down with people and ask them their opinions, their experiences, and that allow you to follow up on what they say. Now, if you combine those two methods, the quant and the qual, or even different types of qual or quant, you can combine this breadth and depth. Very often, people also say you add texture to your quantitative data, for example. A second point is about facilitating verification and triangulation. So as you can imagine, if you use one single method, one type of data, methodological issues mean you might not have all those reliable findings. And what you find might not be a reflection of the truth. It might just be a reflection of the flaws of the method that you use. Or you find a particular pattern, or you find that a program has an impact or no impact. But again, it's just one method that gives you this finding. If you have multiple methods, you can verify across. You can triangulate one finding with other data to see whether it actually adds up. So in a way, it adds more rigor and robustness to your analysis. It also allows for the investigation of a fancy word, non-linearities or complexity. Now again, in the social sciences, and particularly in the work that we do, there's a lot of recognition that the real world is quite difficult and complex. What happens in the real world often doesn't really mirror what we see in theoretical models or hypotheses that basically assume you go from A to B to C, and then we have a model that tests these hypotheses. You might actually go to K first and then to Y and go back to B, because that's how life happens. But if you have one method, say a particularly quantitative method, that really explores those linear pathways, and you don't find any impact, you don't find any changes, because actually what happened in people's lives is they went off sideways, or they went to K, or they went to M, you don't see anything. You don't pick up on it. If you use multiple methods, there is a greater chance that you get an insight into the complexities, dynamics of people's lives, ups and downs, and draw conclusions about that you can then use to inform your programs and your policies. So in all, you really add rigor to research, and it helps you to think outside of the box. And this links to a little bit to the work that we do based on theories of change. I don't know whether you use that term a lot, but we'll come back to that in a minute. So quite a lot of benefits. Just a few illustrations. So what it helps you do is, if you want to evaluate how much change a program makes, how much impact it has on people's lives, you can answer questions like, well, but how much does it change people's lives? And also why or why not? This is an example of a type of program that I work on a lot. It's called a cash transfer program, which you can also compare to welfare or social security that you might have here in Hong Kong and other more high-income countries. These types of programs have expanded a lot, even in countries that are quite poor. So this is in Malawi, which is in southern Africa, a small country. And here they gave cash transfers, so every month a small amount of money to families with young children. And the question was whether the provision of these cash transfers help improve mental health of young people. So this is the assumed pathways, the theory of change, if you will. You give poor households cash transfers. This might lead to children going to school more, having more education. It might reduce the stress amongst caregivers because they have less to worry about in terms of how to make ends meet, how to make sure that they can feed children, provide their needs, etc. And it might also reduce the labor that children or young people do in the families, because there's less need for them to work to earn the money. And finally, there's more consumption of goods, just food, clothing, etc. All of these together might have positive effects on mental health of young people. This is sort of the assumed pathways. Now, this is this picture is based entirely on quantitative findings. So they find that at baseline, 45% of youth in poor rural Malawi experience depressive symptoms. So that's almost 1 in 2 people experiencing some form of depression or symptoms of depression. They find that the cash transfer program reduced depressive symptoms by 17 to 24%. This is a randomized control trial, so with the counterfactual and controlling for other factors, this is an attributable impact of the program. We can say this effect is because of the cash transfer. There were no other factors that determined that depressive symptoms were reduced. What they also tested was to what extent these pathways were confirmed. And it's in this little text here. And they say that pathways such as school enrollment, reduced caregiver stress, and improved support, as well as reduced hard labor, accounted for 46 to 65% of program impact. So in their modeling, they took those factors into account. In their taking one step back, in their survey questionnaire, they asked questions of youth about whether they were going to school, what caregiver stress was there, and whether they were involved in hard labor. And using those factors in their modeling, they were able to explain the variation, 46 to 65% of the variation. So just this quantitative method answers the question by how much did this program have an impact on mental health for youth? And also it answers part of the question why it had an impact, 46 to 65% to be exact. But it also means that there is unexplained variation, unexplained reasons why there is this positive impact. And because in this particular study there was no mixing of methods, there was nothing beyond that particular questionnaire that they collected data with, there was no qualitative element, this is where the explanation stops, because you don't have any more information to work with. Now, if I show you another example, which is on a similar type of program, but a different type of outcome, it gives you an illustration how more pathways can be explored when you mix methods. So this is a study that was actually a review of a similar types of programs, so cash transfers or food transfers, so giving material support to poor households on a regular basis. And this study looked at the impact on IPV, which means intimate partner violence, so domestic violence or violence between spouses or other partner relationships. They explored these different pathways through both quantitative and qualitative data. So in their review, they used different studies, not only paying attention to those that were with an experimental design, but also those that did interviews and discussions with people to understand to what extent does, for example, the receipt of cash transfers lead to greater food security, meaning you go hungry less and you are able to eat twice a day. Does that lead to well-being and happiness at the household level, so the family level? And does that reduce intimate partner violence because there's less stress and greater sense of well-being within the family? So what you can see here, more lines. There is more that can be explained, more dynamics that can be investigated. What you don't see, what you saw in the last slide, are the numbers. So there is more that you can explain, that you can interrogate, that you have narratives about, but there are fewer numbers. If you have the qualitative work alongside the quantitative work, you cannot attach the percentages. You cannot explain the variation in impact by use of numbers. And you have to feel comfortable with that. So if you are, most of you are on the quantitative side of the room, if you really religiously believe in numbers, and I know some do, and that's fair enough, you might feel uncomfortable with that. You think, well, okay, so maybe somebody said that if I receive cash, I can buy food, it makes me happier, and so it probably leads to my husband beating me up less frequently. Maybe that's one person who said that. So how valid is this one person's remark, right? There is a difference between how people using quantitative data evaluate the rigor of the information that they have and how the other researchers do that. And that might be a struggle, and we'll come to that when we start talking about challenges. So it gives you more information, but you also have to feel comfortable using the other type of information and assess its credibility and its rigor. Another example is, I said thinking outside the box, so what mixed methods can help you with. This is some work that we also did on these types of programs, where we said, okay, so it's great that mixed methods can help you think beyond what this is called theories of change. And that's essentially this is essentially a theory of change. You put something in, something happens in the process, and you get something out, right? So it's the pathways that you hypothesize. It's great if you use mixed methods, you get a bigger sense, a greater sense of what's going on within that theory of change. You can explain more about why a program might have an impact or why not. But there's things that happen outside that theory of change. There are things that when we thought about developing a program or a policy that we didn't conceive of, you know, that just weren't in our vision. So if we think about a theory of change within this box, again, same types of programs, in this case called social transfers, them leading to first and second order outcomes. So for example, having more food, and that leading to certain changes such as reduced intimate partner violence. Mixed methods that we just saw can pick up on more explanations of how much change happened and why or why it did not happen. But there's all these things going on outside. There are program processes that have impacts on social dynamics. For example, a lot of these transfers are only going to poor families, which makes sense, no? That those are the people who need it the most. But in the contexts where these programs are implemented, there are a lot of poor people. In rural Malawi, there are a lot of people who could use some extra cash. These programs only have a limited budget. So what they do is they go out to a community. So say you're a community. They do a survey, or they ask all of you, who do you think is poor and who do you think is not poor? And then we maybe choose 3 people who get the transfers. But the 5 of you in the back row, you're only marginally better off than the 3 of you are. So that can create a lot of tension and a lot of problems. And it might mean that you get the cash transfer, and in principle, you have better ability to buy food. But if you are the ones selling the foods, you might say, well, I want you to pay, I know, $10 more. So it can have economic effects, it can have social effects. If you just think about what might happen within your theory of change, even in your qualitative methods, you might not be able to pick up on those issues. So theoretically, the argument is that even within mixed methods, you need to keep an open mind. It can help you to think outside of the box, but you need to take extra steps towards it. One example of where we did this, this was a so-called Cash Plus transfer program in Ethiopia, so another country in Africa, where the government provided people with cash, but also with additional education and training about nutrition. So the particular problem that this program was trying to tackle was the fact that there was very high malnutrition amongst children. So children being underweight, their height being too low for their age and their weight. And whilst the government has been providing cash transfers in Ethiopia for quite some time, and they saw improvements in children's outcomes on a certain number of areas, They didn't see it in nutrition. So they thought if we add these classes, we tell mothers how to feed their children what types of foods, how to cook healthily, how to wash their hands properly, so whenever they touch the food, it's clean and safe. That might help improve the impact. So we worked together with an institute in the US who did the quantitative randomized control trial. They did all survey questionnaires and really looked within this theory of change whether this program indeed led to the desired outcome of greater nutrition for children. Now, the quantitative findings show, unfortunately, it didn't have very much of an impact. So that was quite disappointing for us, for the government. What we did is in parallel, so a little bit like the diagram that you saw before. One team goes out to do the quantitative data collection, another team goes out to do the qualitative data collection. We did the qualitative, but instead of asking quite specifically about what happens in this process, so questions you typically ask are about the payment processes. Do you get your money on time? Do you get all the money that you're entitled to? What are some of the problems around the receipt of money, etc.? We asked broader questions. And one of the things that we did in group discussions is we developed a problem tree. So together with the local team, we sit with women who receive the cash transfers in a group on the floor with flip chart sheets and lots of post-its. And we asked them to develop a problem tree. So we want to tackle undernutrition. What are the root causes that lead to undernutrition? What are the barriers that stop you from feeding children healthy? And so inevitably things around the money come up. They say it's not enough money. We don't get the money on time. We don't get the money that we're entitled to. They don't really speak about any problems with the training or not having enough knowledge. They say we have enough knowledge, but we just don't have enough money to buy the healthy foods. But the biggest thing that is outside of this theory of change that came up as a big sort of red flag every time that we did this exercise, so we did it with multiple groups, was there were two issues actually. One was that there was a massive drought in this area in the months leading up to when we did the evaluation. So it basically meant they had no water. They simply had no water. And if you want to feed your child healthily, then having A, water, and B, safe drinking water is quite crucial. So they couldn't actually give the children enough water, and they couldn't use water to wash their hands, to wash the vegetables, etc. And the second was that there was a lot of pollution in the soil. So whatever they were growing themselves was contaminated. If we hadn't asked questions, even in the qualitative work, in a more broader sense, we wouldn't have had those answers. Now, unfortunately for those who are developing and implementing this program, these findings are worrying because there's not much that they can do about it. This is beyond the remit of this particular program. They cannot start drilling wells, for example. That's a bigger government program. So what you find may be beyond your remit of influence, and that's also something that you need to be open to. You find more, but not everything that you find you will be comfortable with. Okay, so these are some of the benefits. I hope I've shown you some ways in which the use of mixed methods can enrich your data, can enrich your findings, can give you more depth, breadth, texture, etc. So maybe you now think, okay, I'm a quantitative researcher, let's add some methods to my toolkit. I'm going to show you some challenges, and I have mentioned a few already as we went along. Challenges particularly evolve around the practice of things, but then also around the more theoretical side. And that's because mixed methods, they require more of what we do. They require more time, more money, and more expertise. And it's pretty straightforward, right? You add more things to the bag. So you need more resources to make that happen. Time, not necessarily calendar time, because if you have a parallel process, you can make sure that you do the same research in the same time frame. But you need more people time. You need more hands on deck to do that work. And therefore, you definitely need more money. So maybe for those of you who are not yet, you're doing their own research, that seems a bit far off. But if you are doing your own research, that's a big thing if you need more money to do the data collection and analysis. And also, you need more expertise because we all sit in our own comfort zones. We are all educated in a certain discipline, in a certain methodological way of doing things. And if you want to do mixed methods well, you need to cross those boundaries and you need to get people in from different disciplinary backgrounds with different skills. That's not always easy to do, practically, to find those people. But also, it's not always easy to get people to talk to each other and work together in a language that they mutually understand. So there's sort of a perennial problem in mixed methods based on epistemological differences. So the way in which you think about what constitutes data, or underpinning that, what constitutes what we know about reality and truth, and how that relates to how we collect data and use methods in research. So a simple divide is between those on the positivist side and those on the constructivist side. And very schematically, the positivists use more quantitative methods, right? You have a certain theory, and on the basis of that theory, you have hypotheses and you test those hypotheses. Quite straightforward. You have your numbers, you use the models, the modeling to see to what extent your hypotheses hold true. Constructivists work the other way around. And again, it's a bit maybe unfair to draw these boxes like that, but for the sake of the arguments, qualitative researchers tend to sit more on this side. You go out with a much more open lens, collect your data, see what emerges from the data, and then possibly build a theory, rather than having a set list of hypotheses. Now you can see how that can become a clash. If you have a team of researchers who are well equipped to do quantitative methods and another team who are well equipped to do qualitative methods. So the debate isn't just about what are proper methods or how can we bring them together. It becomes a much more fundamental debate about how do we generate knowledge and where does it, is it based on theory and do we test those hypotheses, or do we think that things need to emerge from the data itself? And some of the work that we did a few years ago means that maybe we try to force things together sometimes that don't naturally come together, which undermines the credibility of data. So I kept saying mixed methods adds rigor. But if you don't do mixed methods well, it becomes a very sort of it's a jigsaw puzzle that doesn't fit well, and it undermines the way in which your data comes across. It becomes very complex, and also the usability might be undermined. Each of these researchers have different ways of presenting their data. If you're a quantitative researcher, you have a certain format for your tables. You have a certain format of how you explain percentual change, attributable impact, etc. If you're a qualitative researcher, you have a certain way of representing quotes, of maybe illustrating certain patterns or narratives. These two, bring them together, generates a lot of volume of data, and the way in which you can combine them is not easy. And if you are a user, and particularly a policy user or programmer, you want to get quick answers. You want to know quite quickly, does it work, does it not work, how can I change things? The more stuff you add on to the picture, it becomes less usable. So quite some challenges to deal with in trying to make mixed methods work. But there are different ways of integrating, and there's different levels of integration. And so you can play with that to some extent. At a very basic level, so if you walked away from this lecture and thought, I would like to try some extent of mixed methods, and for most of you that will mean adding some qual to the quant, you can do it in a sequential manner. So instead of doing those two parallel strands, you might say, I'm going to use, well, let's do this one first. I'm going to use qualitative data to verify or explain quantitative findings. So you might have done a certain questionnaire, or you've gone out, you administered a questionnaire with lots of people, you find certain things that either confirm your hypothesis, but let's say it doesn't confirm your hypothesis, and you're not quite sure why. So very purposefully, you might design a particular qualitative element with interviews, with group discussions, with participatory methods to try and understand why your hypothesis doesn't hold. And you can do this in a step-by-step manner. You might also do it the other way around. You could say, well, I want to develop a questionnaire, but I'm not entirely sure what to ask. Now, for psychologists, this might be less of an issue because I know you work with a lot of validated measures. But in social sciences, everything's open. In the questionnaires that we administer, we use questionnaires that have been used before because we know some questions work well, some questions don't work well. But a lot of it is very context specific and very specific to the program that we are evaluating. So we adapt our questionnaires every time we go out, but sometimes we don't know the context well enough. And if we had gone out in Ethiopia to do a problem tree or two before the survey questionnaire was administered, we could have been smart enough to ask the question about water quality, for example, or availability of water. So this is what you sometimes see, particularly in very large program evaluations, because they know once we go out to the field, ask the questions, there's no way of changing it. And if we end up with findings we can't explain, that's going to be super frustrating and unhelpful. So let us put some effort in before. We don't have to do a representative data collection effort, but let's collect some information about people's experiences and opinions to inform the design of our questionnaire. And then this middle one is about the use of quantitative data to maybe decide on your sample for qualitative data. And now the example I talk about later about child poverty is a good one. So you might have a sample of people, a group of people with different characteristics, and you want to understand their experiences based on their different characteristics. So you might sample from each of these based on your sampling framework from your quantitative data. But beyond just the simple characteristics, maybe you want to do some cluster analysis to see who fits in different groups. And you can use that to then invite them for qualitative research. Now, the benefit of this is it's quite easy to implement. There are very clear lines of separation. What do you do first, what do you do next, and why, and then very clear lines of integration. So in contrast to the picture that we saw before, you don't end up in this situation at the very end when you have all your quantitative data and then all your qualitative data and you sort of try to bring it together. Now you have one set of data first and you have a very clear reason why you want to go to the next step to either collect the qualitative data to add to the quant or the other way around. And that also means that you have quite clear remits for the particular researchers that are involved. If you're a quant researcher, you go out and ask one of your colleagues who can do the qual research to help you with the next step, or the other way around. So this, I would say, is your very first step into doing mixed methods. The second one is the one that we saw before, so it's the parallel way of doing it. And as I said, this is probably the mostly used way of integrating or mixing methods. So you do each of them separately at the same time, and you do that to investigate related sub-questions in answering the overall research question. So you understand different pieces of the puzzle, because you realize my methods in isolation can only answer different questions. If I bring them together, I can answer the overall question: how much does the program have an impact, and why or why not? And you combine your data at the stage of data analysis. That's when things come together. So it is fairly easy to implement, particularly leading up to the data analysis phase. You can have a quantitative team that goes out, you can have a qualitative team. So you have two teams that have their expertise, they work independently within their own comfort zones. Only at the very end, you bring it together. And that's also the downside. That can become quite tricky, because you have two sets of information that are collected separately by separate teams that find maybe different things. To try and bring that together can be quite a challenge. Not only because of the volume of data, but because then you also have to bring that expertise together, combine it somehow. So these are the graphs we saw before. This is very much an illustration of the process. And this is a more practical example from one paper, which was about evaluating the effects of particular school reforms on student attendance and performance. So it's about different methods to looking at different things, different questions you want to answer, but also investigating the issue at different levels. So the levels of schools, the levels of students and teachers, etc. So this really is a very multi-stranded design, with not just two parallel streams of quant and qual, but multiple streams of quant and multiple streams of qualitative data. So when you think about that first slide with the definition of mixed methods, with all these different colored balls in the box, and we said mixed methods can be anything, this side alone would already be mixed methods, even though it's all quantitative, right? Because it's analysis of school records, which isn't primary data that you went out to collect, apart from going to the schools and collecting either paper-based forms or going into their software, and observation of class behavior. So it's all different ways of collecting your data. So this is a multi-layered parallel system. And then the final form, the most complex way of integrating and mixing methods, is the full combination. And to be honest, I haven't really seen much of this, because what it means is you integrate data collection and analysis with different methods all at the same time. Ideally, it would mean you have a team of researchers and they go out to interview people, and maybe they start with a questionnaire, but as soon as they find out that you're an interesting case, or if you say, well, oh, that's an interesting question, hang on, I have a story to tell, or my father 20 years ago, this or that happened, you pick up on that and you follow that route, if you will. It allows to be adaptive and flexible, but it also asks you as researchers and as a team to be flexible and adaptive, and to have a lot of different expertise. So you need to be an enumerator who can do the quantitative, if you go out to administer the surveys, and then pick up on what people say and take a more qualitative route. If you do the analysis of the data, you need to be able to work with the numbers and also process text, either quantitatively or qualitatively. So this can become very complex practically in terms of collecting the data and also in terms of analyzing the data. And then it can also become quite tricky to present the data in a way that's meaningful to people. So it's quite difficult to implement. It requires expertise of multiple methods at the phases of data collection and analysis. And I've sort of ignored the write-up here, but that's definitely not something that we should gloss over. So you can almost see them on a spectrum, from easier to more advanced, definitely the more advanced option. So just to wrap this up, how you would use them and how you choose the level of integration and how you might do it, it serves different purposes. To verify and triangulate the data you get, the information and findings from different methods, to add depth, to understand why, and to think outside the box. And primarily that happens at the more advanced stage of your mixing of methods. Okay, so that's 1 hour in. This is what I wanted to say about what mixed methods are and how you can use them. Before I go into an example of our own work in more detail. So before I do that, are there any questions or comments or thoughts about mixed methods? Yeah.
It's like not really about topics, but maybe a bit. Like maybe that was like a bit out of the topic, but I think like most important is like the morality or like the manners or like the stance of the research team.
Yeah.
Like if they are strongly believing in some of the method or like the program that they introduce to developing countries, then they may thought like this should work or like yeah, that's possible way. So when they show their result, even though like numbers sometimes can be really tricky, like the problem I discovered is like they always shows like they evaluate their program right after like 1 year after the program, then that will be, for example, like the clarifying the water or like making the water clean in the developing countries. So they introduce advanced machine or something like that, and they like the survey after that, they say that that was really effective in like cleaning their water. But like some other like research team do it again, like to evaluate that like 10 years after or 5 years after, they develop that actually like many of like the local people go back to their like traditional way of like doing how they clean the water. So in fact, they are not using the advanced machine because they think that is like really troublesome or they have a lack of knowledge and sometimes like that. So it's like really about the morality or like manners or the stance of the research team itself. Yeah.
I think it's a very good point. And it speaks, in my opinion, more broadly to program evaluation and maybe not so much the morality, but the difficulty of looking at things over a longer period of time. So as a researcher on many of these types of programs, it's not that I just want to see the positive impact and therefore I just look at what happens immediately after or maybe 1 year after, and I don't look at the long term because I don't want to see if it doesn't work. The problem for us is that these program evaluations are often paid for by those who implement the program. So the program I showed you in Ethiopia is implemented by the government, but it's funded through UNICEF.
I see.
And UNICEF funds us to do the evaluation, but the evaluation has to happen within the project timeline. So that's about until 6 months after the program has ended. So it's a general difficulty, mixed methods or no mixed methods, but it's a very good point because increasingly as researchers on these kinds of programs, we are arguing that we need to collect longitudinal data so that we can see over time what happens. So this program, but also more generally in understanding people's lives. So we see in relation to poverty now, because we have the longitudinal data, that there's a lot of dipping in and out. So people don't, when I talk about those linear pathways, people don't go on a trajectory of moving up and then plateauing middle class, for example. A lot of people have a lot of drops and peaks.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
see. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. Yep.
I just wonder whether what's the proportion of these two types of methods? Say, is it always preferable to do 50-50 or 60-40? But can we do 80 if we are a die-hard fan of quantitative methods? Should we do 80% of quantitative methods, but 20? Can we still claim that it is a mixed method?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. I mean, it depends a little bit what you base your proportions on to begin with. Is it the time you spend on it, the amount of money you spend on it, the sample? Because,
That
for
may be
example,
the sample then.
so the sample for qualitative will almost always be smaller than the
Oh, yeah,
sample
that's
for
right, yeah.
quantitative. So from that perspective, it's no problem at all.
Maybe efforts then, maybe.
Efforts. I think so. So in the sequential way of doing mixed methods, for example, I think it's absolutely valid if you have certain findings from your quantitative analysis that you cannot explain or that you would like to dig into, that you do a relatively small but meaningful qualitative data collection exercise and analysis. The only way, the only thing I would say is that you need to give it some thought. So if you interview 10 people in a very in-depth manner and you think that gives you enough data to explain what you want to explain, then that's fine. But you need to have some explanation as to why you select, even if it's a small group of people, and what you think you will do with that. And that is sometimes a problem in mixed methods, particularly in evaluations, where the focus is on the quantitative and there is a bit of a qualitative add-on, that sometimes the qualitative feels like an add-on because there hasn't been enough thought about the sampling and the questions that are asked. If you give it thought, even if it's a relatively small proportion, I think it's absolutely valid, and it can be valuable as well. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to dive into the example. This is quite detailed, so bear with me. It's about child poverty. It's about the research that we did over a 3-year time period from 2012 to 2015. And it is about a question that is related to this diagram. So imagine this. We are looking at children, young children, and we want to understand how well they're doing, their well-being, or in other words, whether they are poor or not. Now, there are two different strands in how we can think about living in poverty. The most dominant strand, which I think is also used here, is called monetary poverty. And it's entirely based on looking at whether you, as a child, live in a family that has either enough income or enough wealth or enough assets, enough material aspects, resources to live a good life. Yeah, that's monetary poverty. And you can't see it, but it's in this bubble. The other strands, focusing on the study of poverty, says, well, we can look at the material and at the economic resources that families have, but it doesn't tell you necessarily about how the people within those families are doing, particularly for children. If you have a reasonable amount of money, it doesn't necessarily mean that children are going to school, that they receive proper health care when they are sick. In cases like Ethiopia, that they actually are able to drink safe water or have a clean toilet. So what we should be doing is look at these different dimensions and look at multidimensional poverty. So these are the two different strands. So this is multidimensional child poverty, this is monetary child poverty. Now, different scholars say different things about how these two different types of poverty relate. Some say they are exactly the same. If you have enough money, you can make sure that children go to school, have safe drinking water, and have a good toilet. But actually, what we find is that this is not the case. So there is some overlap, which is why these bubbles overlap. But there's also mismatch. So there are children that are this is the overlap. These are children in this overlap of the bubble that are living in households that don't have enough economic resources and that also are multidimensionally poor. Makes sense, right? So there's not enough money in the family, children aren't able to go to school, etc. That's this piece of the pie. Then there is what we call so-called positive mismatch. These are children that live in families that don't have enough income, but somehow they still manage to do well in those other areas, schooling, health, sanitation, etc. And then on the opposite end, there are children that live in families that are doing quite well from an economic perspective, but that don't go to school. No? So there's the negative mismatch. Now, what this research tried to find out is why do we have this mismatch? Particularly on this side, if families have enough money, why do their children not go to school? Why don't they drink safe water, etc.? And we used a mixed methods approach to try and find out. We went to 3 different countries, Ethiopia, Burundi, and Vietnam. So 2 countries in Africa and this one closer to home, to look at the situation in these 3 different countries and to try and understand why this might be the case. In 2 of these countries, we worked with national survey data that is collected by statistics offices. In Vietnam and Ethiopia, we had what's called so-called living standards survey data. So these are samples with thousands and thousands of families where data is collected every 3, 4, 5 years, depending on the capacity of the statistical office, about income, expenditures, income generating activities, occupation, etc. Often they tend to be publicly available at some point, so researchers can work with them. In Burundi, we collected our own data in relation to a program evaluation, so it was primary data that we could use for ourselves. So I'll start with the case for Ethiopia and Vietnam, because we used the quantitative survey data, the secondary data, on all these thousands of families and therefore children to see the scope of this mismatch. So what was the proportion of children who were in this part of the pie, in this piece of mismatch and this piece, and to use regression modeling to see what kind of characteristics of the children and of their families that could explain some of the factors associated with being in these different groups. That gave us some answers, but not a lot, because in these kinds of surveys, the information that you have about family situation is quite limited. We know about, of course, we know about the age, we know where people live, we know about the education of parents, we know about their jobs roughly, but that's about where it stops. So we can see that there is an association with education. If parents are more highly educated, it is less likely that children are in this bubble, for example. If jobs are better, then also it's less likely that they are in any of these bubbles. So we got some answers there, but we realized very much this quantitative data gives us a good indication of the proportions of children in these bubbles, but not so much about why. So what we want to do is we want to explore this using qualitative data. Now, a particular issue here was the matching problem, because in Ethiopia and Vietnam we used secondary quantitative data. What that means is that we don't have access to the sampling frame. We don't have access to the names of people who were in the sample because of ethical reasons. It would be very wrong if a statistical office gave us the names and all the information of the people that they interviewed. Which was problematic for us because ideally we would have gone to families with children in these different parts of the bubbles to ask, so you're earning enough money, why aren't your children going to school? Of course, in a less leading and better, ethically better way, but essentially that's what we wanted to do. We couldn't. So we had to find a different way of getting there. Our quantitative data, the sample, wasn't going to help us to draw the sample of the qualitative data. What we had to do is come up with some exercise to, in a qualitative way, at a community level, try and identify children in these different bubbles. So we used a so-called community child poverty profiling exercise, and it's based on exercises that are used a lot in qualitative methods in these kinds of program evaluations or evaluations of programs that I showed you before. And there are 6 stages to this, so bear with me. We go into a community, we sit in a group with community members who know the community well, and we ask first, can you establish community-specific categories and criteria for what constitutes monetary poverty or not having good household wealth? Now, here in Hong Kong, maybe that's quite straightforward. Maybe that's just not earning enough income. But it might also be not owning your own place, or, I don't know, sometimes it's about transport, not having your own transport. In Ethiopia, it was a lot about not having livestock, not having your own cows, for example, not having your own lands, not having your own house. The second question relates to that second type of poverty, multidimensional child poverty or child well-being. What are the criteria in this community that will make you say that child is not doing well, that child is poor? So that could be not going to school. It often also meant not living in a household with 2 parents, having to work, for example. But it all depended on what the community members said, so we made it context specific. And then the second thing that we asked people to do is to map or list all the families in that particular community. So we had to make sure it was a manageable community. We couldn't refer to 250 households or families. And to then, for each of those families, establish what category of wealth or the monetary side of things they belong to and what category of child poverty they belong to. And then finally, particularly when there is mismatch, to discuss why do you think that there is this mismatch? And to use that as our sampling frame to go to the families and explore in more detail. So just some pictures of what it looked like. This is from Vietnam. This is the overview of monetary poverty, and this is the overview of child poverty. So we created 3 different categories. This was not doing very well, this was sort of in the middle, and this was doing very well. And you can see that the members categorized the community as a whole, 80% not doing very well, 20% is doing reasonably, and nobody doing very well, with criteria related to housing, I think also related to the number of children. So different types of things that they identified. And they did the same for child poverty. Yeah. The next step was the mapping or the listing of households. So this is an example from Burundi, where we mapped. So this is the main roads. They drew the houses. And what we did alongside, we discussed for each one, do you think, what category of household wealth do they belong to, what category of child poverty? And we discussed for each house. And then in our notes, we made a list. Main name for the household, category bad for child well-being, and the wealth. We also denoted the category. If there was a mismatch for this first one, for example, people said they are doing average in terms of wealth, but not so good in terms of child well-being. We discuss. So we say it's a yes, there's mismatch. We discuss why this is the case. And we also went to the households. So we did this in these 3 different countries. Now, the nice thing of Burundi was that we did have primary quantitative data. So we had this information for Abraham, his family, from the qualitative data, from the discussions in the community, but also from the quantitative data. And we were able to validate our exercise, or at least compare it to the findings from our quantitative data. So remember, the exercise was to circumvent the problem that we didn't have any primary data for children. So we wanted to identify whether there was any mismatch, what group they belonged to, on the basis of this exercise. But the Burundi data, primary in both cases, gave us the opportunity to see whether what we identified children to be, or what group to belong to, in the exercise actually mapped onto what we found in the quantitative data. And so to what extent the exercise was a good way of identifying this mismatch in absence of primary data. So we looked at the magnitude of poverty overlap and mismatch, the identification of case studies, and some of the realities on the ground. This is the diagram with the same overlaps, but with the numbers that give a magnitude of how big these groups are. So, and this is longitudinal data over time. And you can see what I said before, there's quite some changes over time, dips in and out. So in Ethiopia in 1999, 19% of children experienced both types of poverty. In 2004, this went up quite a bit to 25%, and then it dropped back down again. But we can see that roughly 1 in 4, and this stays more or less constant over time, 1 in 4 children are in one of those mismatch households. So they are either in a family that is monetary poor, but they still have multidimensional well-being, and the other way around. Now, when we look at the findings for these percentages from the qualitative data, we can see that this is quite different. So we find here that the positive mismatch and the negative mismatch is much smaller, and the overlap is much higher. So when we spoke to community members, they identified a lot less mismatch than we identified in the quantitative data, but not for the same households. So we see here that they might not necessarily give the same finding, even though it's a different sample. In Vietnam, the community data identified more positive mismatch and less negative mismatch in comparison to the survey data. In Burundi, they gave greater negative mismatch. Now, if we think about the dynamics underpinning some of these answers, some of that might make sense. So here, for example, in Vietnam, they identified more positive mismatch. What does that mean? It means community members were more likely to tell us that even though their neighbor is poor in economic terms, they are sending their children to school, etc. In other words, they're doing the right thing for their children. And that's because when we observed the dynamics of the group discussion, we found that people were quite reluctant to speak badly about their neighbors. So you can sense less objectivity there, but also find something quite different, quite interesting about the community dynamics. There is this sense of peer pressure, etc. Now, in Burundi, it's the opposite. We find greater negative mismatch. Why is that? Well, we did this research in relation to a program evaluation, a program that gave people a lot of support. And what you often find in these evaluations is that people portray their situation or talk about other people's situations in their communities in a worse way than they actually are, possibly in the hope of getting more support in the future. So rather than thinking I can't talk badly about my neighbor, they might have thought, if I portray the situation in this community poorly, and it was poor, I mean, I'm not saying that they were really lying, poorly, then maybe more support might be coming in the future. So what, and this is quite common to qualitative research, there's a lot more reflection. Why do I find the findings that I find, and why does it relate differently or compare differently to the quantitative findings? In Burundi, we looked at whether the findings between the qualitative data and the quantitative were consistent. We find that there are consistent findings for about 1/4 to 1/3 to 1/4, partially consistent findings. This means that it was right for some children in the household, but not for all children. The use of the quantitative and qualitative data in this case meant that we had an inconsistency in the unit of analysis. So the quantitative data took the child as a unit of analysis, and the qualitative data asked community members about children in that family. And so the unit of analysis was the family rather than the households. We tried to drill down to individual children, but community members don't have enough information to say it's different for the young child versus the older child, or the daughter or the son. So they referred to the family as a whole. And when we compared the household level data with the individual level data, we find that for some children, the mismatch that they identified was correct, and for some it wasn't, which in a way links up a lot with data and information that we have about poverty and child poverty. If we look at what happens at the family level, we only have a very partial picture, because things can differ a lot for individual children in families. And then also quite high percentages of just inconsistent findings. So the quants didn't add up to the qual. Now, this is partly because of the community dynamics I just spoke to you about, the way in which community members portray the situation of others for various reasons, but also for methodological reasons in the quantitative data. In the quantitative data in Burundi, we had a really tough time to get good information about people's wealth, the income they earned, the assets they held, partly because, again, people might not feel very comfortable telling you exactly what they have. They don't want to portray the situation as being too good, but also because the way in which people earn money is very different from how we earn money. They don't have jobs and, having tax forms and all that. It's selling a few things in the market here, maybe working in exchange for a bag of rice there. So it's very difficult for people to exactly indicate how much they earn. And that came through in the data. But when we went out to look at families and situations of individual children, we did find those stories of mismatch and why they might be there. And we did also find consistency with some of the quantitative findings. So this was Sarah. She was living with her father. Her mother, I think, had passed away or had left the household, but she was living with her father on her own. And she gave a very nuanced perspective herself of her well-being, also indicating that it's not a very black and white picture. So she said it's good and it's bad. It's good because I am going to school, but it's bad because I have to work when I come back from school. It's good, as her father says, that she doesn't have to work for other households, but she has to really put a lot of hours in at home. Now, she would like to move on to another school, which is further away after her secondary education, but her father won't let her. And if we look at the situation of this family, the characteristics, in relation to the quant data, we can see some linkages. Single parents households, also male caregivers, there's generally more negative mismatch than with female caregivers, and also the occupation of being a farmer. So looking at the narratives on the ground, we do see triangulation. Now, some of the things that you will come across in mixed methods research is exactly this. You have to try and explain some of your discrepancies, right? And because that's the reality. If you use multiple methods, you will find that the stories don't always add up. And that can create a lot more stress than add value if you wanted just to do more methods to add rigor or add depth and texture to your data. But, and I've explained some of these already, why we see these discrepancies. But you can ask yourself, should we stress out and worry that our data and our findings are therefore no longer useful? They disagree with each other. Did we fail in our study, or do we use the different data and the ways in which they don't add up to try and understand what's going on? And I hope that by telling you some of the dynamics underpinning these different findings, we actually had more richness in our findings. We were understanding something about the community dynamics. We were understanding something about how the community relates to the family and to the individual children. So I'm showing you this picture because even though it's quite difficult, we try to find greater reality in these different methods and the way in which the findings clashed, in explaining why children might live in families where there's good economic resources but bad outcomes for them personally, and the other way around. And one of the ways in which we try to bring all of this together in a way that's actually digestible for people, and I will admit, the slides that I just showed you are not very easy to digest. We asked the graphic designer to picture it, to picture the main findings in a diagram. So this is one that's across 3 countries, and then these ones are for each country separately. And we try to condense everything in those in like a 4-page policy brief. And I have a few here if you're interested, to try and really drill down to the key findings, which is not an easy fit when you have so much data and richness. So if you want an easy way out to do your research, I think you should stick to your single methods. If you want a challenge, and if you want to try and collect more data, understand better, explain more, then please by all means try to, in small steps, add to, this is my last sentence, add to the research. So this was literally my last slide. Okay? So they can do a lot. They are challenging, but most of all, they ask you to engage with an open mind. Okay, so it's an hour and a half. I'm going to do what I said I was going to do in the beginning. I'm going to ask you to come up to the front again, and ask you about what you think of mixed methods. And don't worry if you say, I'm not interested, I don't take it as a judgment of this seminar, or I don't feel bad about it, that's fine. It's entirely up to you whether you think maybe this is something worth giving a go, either in my research or if you're studying, looking at studies that take a little bit more of a broader perspective. please come to the front. Okay, so you're all almost here. So let's make it a little bit of a spectrum, because I don't want you to just say yes or no. I know that's always tricky. So who is a little bit more familiar? So I'm not asking you yet whether you're excited. Who feels a little bit more familiar with mixed methods? If you think, I really can't get my head around it, it's a lot, that side. If you think, oh, that was actually, I learned quite a lot, please move to that side. Or somewhere in the middle. I like how people are lining themselves up quite nicely. Okay, so we have quite a nice spectrum. Right. I'm not going to ask you any follow-up questions about this, don't worry. I now want to know who thinks I might want to look into this a little bit more. I might want to do it, or I might want to explore research or studies that use more methods than just one, or maybe more than I'm just familiar with. If you feel a little bit interested, no, if you're not interested at all, that's fine as well. Move to that side. And then as you slowly, gradually have become a little bit more interested, you can move to this side. Like how we have, okay, so we are all converging a little bit to this side. That's great. I think there might be a little bit of, what's it called? Socially desirable answering, but that's okay. I'll take it. So you're all a little bit more interested in mixed methods research. That's great. Okay, I want to give you the last chance to ask any questions or comments that you might have in relation to mixed methods in this presentation.